Today we are starting week 14 and lecture number 14 is Linguistic and Cultural Aspects of Translation in Intercultural Communication. In the outline we have two main questions. The first one, translation as a linguistic act of communication across cultures. The second question, three types of difficulties in translation and interpretation, which has three subpoints: multiple meaning of words, denotative and connotative meanings, areas of perception equivalence, here literalism, transliteration and paronymy, and correlation of linguistic and cultural norms of translation. Intercultural communication is impossible without translation or interpretation from the source, which is the language from which a text is to be translated into another language, into the target language, the language into which a text in a given language is to be translated. Translation is a peculiar type of cross-cultural communication. It's a kind of activity which inevitably involves at least two languages and two cultural traditions. Translation is not only a linguistic act, it is also a cultural act and act of communication across cultures. The translation process is like a car that needs a good driver to control the steering wheel in the right direction, and a translator who knows not only both languages but also both cultures is not only bilingual but also bicultural. The process of translation in cross-cultural communication presupposes that a source message of one language should be perceived by a interpreter of the other language. This involves cognitive processing of recognizing the message and in tracing the content from a code, meaning language as a system based on grammatical and semantic structures. Translation is a communication process which involves the transfer of a message from a source language to a target language. Interpreting and translation process are examples of transactional communication. An interpreter and a translator both have equal communication functions, outputting and inputting messages simultaneously and intertwined by the spoken or written to exchange and negotiate meaning with a third party. The transactional model is a more realistic representation of human communication. It recognizes that both people involved in the interaction are communicators, and instead of the process illustrated as linear, it becomes circular in its function. The two people engaged constantly respond to each other by initiating messages and sending responses back and forth. Thus, the process is an exchange including the following stages. The first one, encode and decode messages. Encoding is the process by which information from a source is converted into symbols to be communicated. Decoding is the process in which the receiver accepts and interprets the message. It involves not simply basic recognition and comprehension of what a text says, but also the interpretation and evaluation of its meaning with reference to relevant codes. The second is engage in role-taking and feedback. The message and interpretation constructed by each individual are influenced by the role-taking assessment and the feedback they provide. As a person speaks, the other individual is simultaneously assessing his or her response on the basis of feedback and may be modifying parts of the message as well. The third, influenced by prior communication. The messages people send and the manner in which they respond weigh heavily on what has been said previously. The fourth, influenced by physical surroundings. Different environments contribute to different modes and methods of communication. The fifth, influenced by socio-cultural situation. The message and the manner in which it is delivered is part of an ongoing social situation that has rules for behavior. The sixth, influenced by social relationship. The type of social relationship between the communicators, whether they may be strangers or intimate, influences the transaction. Translation is a peculiar type of intercultural communication. It's a kind of activity which inevitably involves at least two languages and two cultural traditions. Translation process should be essentially be concerned with a certain text, situation, and culture. What can lead to mistakes in translation? A scientist, Andy Gillard, in the article Intercultural Communication, states that the second language speakers of English may have and may be unfamiliar with much idiomatic or technical English, be unfamiliar with jargon and acronyms, not be used to hearing English, speed of delivery is a problem, not be used to the pronunciation of some words, not familiar with complex language, have particular difficulty with some areas of language, and have troubles in understanding cultural constructions. Nevertheless, the greatest source of difficulty is that words often have different meanings depending upon context or culture. Thus, the greatest source of difficulty is that words have different meanings depending upon culture and context. Thus, a dry country lacks either water or alcohol. Suspenders keep up either stockings or trousers. A funny is either humorous or disconcerting. A couple is either a few or exactly two. If you recognize that there is a potential misunderstanding, you must stop the conversation and ask for the valid interpretation. There are some more examples as evidence of the need to distinguish between possible meanings of a word when translating. The word for fish can be used to refer to either a live fish swimming in a river, the one that got away, or a dead fish that has been cleaned and is ready for frying pan. In English, fish can be used in both cases. Ambiguity in meaning may cause confusion in what is conveyed and lead to different interpretations of current context. There are a lot of difficulties in translation and interpretation. So even though one speaker may have learned the vocabulary of the other language, selecting the most appropriate words with the correct intonation, spoken with the appropriate eye contact while standing a proper distance from the other, are all critical even before one considers the priority and propriety of the topic to be discussed. Lack of understanding is a failure to interpret parts of or all what the other person is saying or doing. The lack of understanding may be conscious and unconscious, that is, you may or may not notice that you have not understood. The lack ran if it is conscious lead to an attempt to do something about it, such as to say that you have not understood or to ask for an explanation. The lack of understanding can also be allowed to pass in spite of the fact that you are aware of it, perhaps because owing to a lack of time or to an inferior status, you do not consider yourself in a position to ask for help or to admit that you have not understood. One difficulty in translation stems from the fact that the most words have multiple meanings. The first type of translation difficulty can be most easily resolved. It is the case where a word can be either a word of general vocabulary or a specialized term. Words are not limited to one single meaning. Most words have multiple meanings categorized as either denotative or connotative. Denotative meaning of a word is its literal meaning. Take the word mother, for example. Connotative or secondary meaning of a word or expression, in addition, is the associated to its explicit or primary meaning. Translations from one language to another are often subject to great debate, since the connotative meaning of a word can be quite different from one language to another, as languages are certainly influenced by culture they are a part of. The English expression "thank you" is a problem going into Japanese. There are several translations that are not interchangeable and depend on factors such as whether the person being thanked was obliged to perform the service and how much effort was involved. The verb run is another example of a word that causes a lot of trouble for translation. In a given language, the translation of run as the next step up in the speed from jogging will not necessarily be the same word as that used to translate the expression run a company or run long when referring to a play or meeting, or run dry when referring to a river. Let's have a look at the expression having been taken from the dictionary entry. Examples: to manage or to operate, to run a business, управлять компанией, to run a boat through a planner, строгать доску, to run out a cable, травить кабель, to run a check off on something, осуществлять контроль, проводить проверку чего-либо, which has no regular meaning with the dictionary entering the first meaning. The second type of difficulty is connected with errors in perception of equivalence, literalism, transliteration, and paronymy. What is literalism? Literalism is a disposition to interpret statements in their literal sense. The point is that accurate translation requires an understanding of the text, which includes an understanding of the situation and an enormous variety of facts about the world in which we live. Literal translation is the translation that reproduces communicatively irrelevant elements of the source text. This usually happens when the translator copies the source language form or on this or that level of the language. Transliteration attempts to use a one-to-one correspondence and be exact so that an informed reader should be able to reconstruct the original spelling of unknown transliterated words. Ideally, reverse transliteration is possible. The transliteration discussed above can be regarded as transliteration in the narrowed sense. In a broader sense, the word transliteration may include both transliteration in the narrow sense and transcription. So what is paronymy? Paronymy is the relationship between two or more words partly identical in form or meaning, which may cause confusion in perception or reproduction. In the narrow sense, the term paronymy refers to sound-alike words, homophones such as affect, effect, feminine, feminist, but in the wider sense, it converts any look-alike or mean-alike confusable words. In addition to it, I should say that no dictionary can contain all the solutions, since the problem is always changing as people use words in usual way. These usual uses of words happen all the time. Some only last for the life of a conversation or an editorial. Others catch on and became part of the language. In order to reproduce an acceptable translation, translator must find acceptable words. There may be many potential translations for a given word, and often more than one of the potential translations will be acceptable on a given occasion in a given source text. As always, there is a connection between the new meaning and the old. The way to overcome this difficulty is to recognize whether you are using the word as an item of general vocabulary or a specialized term. The third difficulty is the context, mainly sensitiveness to the cultural context, which include the intent audience of the translation that is referred in correlation of linguistic and cultural norms of translation. Meaning is not some abstract object that is independent of people and culture. Being sensitive to the audience also means using a level of language that is appropriate. Usually, translators risk inappropriate spillover of source language idiom and usage into the target language translation. On the other hand, spell lovers have imported useful source language calques and loanwords that have enriched the target languages. Indeed, translators have helped substantially to shape the languages into which they have translated. Sometimes the misleading of the audience merely results to boredom. However, it can also have serious long-term effects. For example, the term clubland may pose problems which are rooted in the oblivions of the word club in its traditional sense refer to exclusive gentlemen's club and its more recent meaning a nightclub. In reality, Clubland is London's famous nightlife district. So we find out that there are three types of translation difficulty. The first is distinguishing between general vocabulary and specialized terms. The second, that errors in perception of equivalents are literalism, transliteration, and paronymy. The third one is taking into account the total cultural context, including the intended audience and important details such as religionalisms. In addition to it, to reproduce an acceptable translation or interpretation in cross-cultural communication, one must find acceptable words in the other language and culture. Culture determines how people speak, write, and perceive each other. Consequently, cultural elements therefore must be present implicitly in text, but as a background feature they are implicit.